Hello everyone, this is me, Kraus, future VTuber extraordinary, or however you say it, I don't know. Anyway, this will be my first attempt to do an ASMR video about history talk. Now I thought a lot about this, and I kinda always put it on the side. I just thought, it probably won't be very good if I do it like this. I wrote text and so on, and I thought I would just read it off, but I feel like I talk the best about history when I just, talk however I want to talk and just say whatever I want to say. I have one topic on mind and some other things that have been crossing my mind on history, of course, and maybe some other things. It will probably be all over the place, but anyway, this is the first Kraus. Crosset? Crossbar? I don't know what name I will go for, but it will be the first history ASMR video that I will, I guess, put on YouTube or something like that. I mean, I just noticed that screen on the back. That is quite fitting. I just saw it because it's very well optimized. Anyway, and I like this avatar, so I'm using this one. No reason. Ooh, oh my. Anyway, don't get distracted, Cross. It's time to talk about history. Well, I say history. I mean, it is history, like basically everything is in a way. It will be more on the technical aspect of a certain time period about a certain thing. Namely, I want to talk about World War II. Of course, it has to start with something classic like that. Because, everybody loves World War II. Which is kind of strange. You would think that it's probably one of the worst times in history to, be part of the whole mess. I wouldn't want to be, but people still kind of love it. Anyway, my trackers are not very well. Anyway, but yeah, what about World War II? I mean, you could basically talk about so many things, but I will start with something I'm very passionate about. That is aircrafts. Yes. Basically, aircrafts played an insanely important role in World War II in the technical aspects and how they changed from the beginning to the end is quite all over the place. For example, the main fighter of the German Air Force in 1935 was a biplane. And at the end of 1940, well, I mean, not the end of 1945, but 1945 and even 1944, Germany used a jet fighter. I mean, it's a bit different than you might think of a jet fighters today, but if you think about it, in 10 years, we went from biplanes to jet aircraft. That is quite the difference, and well, there's basically infinite amount to talk about, and I will just talk about whatever comes to my mind. We could also compare aircraft, but that is a very touchy subject, to be fair. I believe there will be a lot of people who will say the best aircraft of World War II or top 10 fighter aircraft of World War II. I mean, first thing we need to do is look at a certain type like fighters. Let's do fighters. But then usually what I find out is people are extremely biased. Like Americans will say it's the P-51D Mustang. Russians will probably say it's the Yak-3. British will say it's the Spitfire. Germans will probably say the B-109. The Japanese will probably say Zero. And of course, all of them are very unbiased, of course. Well, but the first thing we need to, make sure of is comparing aircraft is kind of pointless in a certain way. You can compare them if they fought against each other, for example, but let's take the best American fighter and the best Russian fighter, or the Soviets. Should I say Soviet or Russian? I'll just jump in between one or the other, but I hope you don't mind, my dear viewers. Wink. Anyway, what was that? All right, the best Russian and the best American fighter. The American fighter would probably be P-51, especially late variants, the so-called Mustang. Well, there's not much to say. It is an extremely good aircraft. It had a bubble canopy for perfect visibility. It was armed with 650 caliber machine guns with, I guess how would an American say, shit ton of ammo. On the wings, it had very long endurance and very long range. It performed excellent at high altitude, for it was designed to be exactly that, a long altitude fighter, mostly for escorting the bomber formations. On the other hand, the Russian Yak-3 would be a very different aircraft. It had less armament. It had two 50 caliber machine guns with not much ammo and a 20 millimeter, but all of them were not on the wings, but in the nose. The cannon shooting through the engine cowling at the center, and two on top of the engine cowling, the machine guns I mean, with not much ammo to be fair. It also had a bubble canopy for extremely good visibility. But if you would, compare them and say which one was better, I mean, both of them were designed for really, really different things. As I said, America had in mind long range, high altitude performance, endurance. Russians didn't really go with the whole I mean, they had aircraft which would be decently well at high altitude, but the Soviets usually really heavily relied on attackers, like close air support for the ground forces, most notably the IL-2 Sturmovik. Maybe I wonder if I can put pictures in here, like in when I edit the video. Well, let's see. I hope I will be able to do that. And that thing was, of course, very close to the ground, so the Russians had needed aircraft that would perform rather well at low altitude. And the Yak-3 was exactly that, probably the best performing aircraft at low altitude. It was amazing acceleration, good climb rate, very good dogfighting capabilities. And now if you compare the P-51 and the Russian Yak-3, you would notice that they were just so different with their design and the ideas what they were used to be used for. So if you, let's say, you would get the Yak-3 and put it in American service, the P-51 in Soviet service. The Soviets actually used P-51 through the Lend-Lease. But both sides would become much less successful with those designs, even though it would be the still aircraft and they were successful in their own front. So yeah, that's quite a conundrum if you want to compare aircrafts. If the Russians would have fought the Americans or the other way around, they would have designed the aircraft completely different, of course. But they didn't. They had, their very specific enemies who they had to fight. The Americans had to deal with the Japanese and the Germans. And, so there you go. But to be fair, if I had to choose between the Yak or the P-51, I'd always go for the Yak. I just like it so much more. It's generally a cooler aircraft in my opinion. But that is, of course, just a biased opinion. Please keep that in mind. A lot of the things I probably say are wrong or maybe misguided, but I'll do my best, which I always do. Anyway, basically, where was I? But yes, comparing aircraft. Now, if we look, and the funny thing is, I would actually, if we would look at best aircraft, and something that I found very funny, if you look at the top, let's take at, usually top 10 aircraft. They would usually start with, oh, we're not counting things like the Me-262 jet fighter the Germans had because it just came so late in the war and they built so few of them during it. Meanwhile, you go through the list and at the number one will be the British Spitfire Griffin variant. And I always thought that funny because the Griffin Spitfire was just as late as the Me-262 and they built even less of them. So I feel like they just went with this, oh yeah, we won't count these things so I can make my list however I want it, arbitrary reasons. But let's just talk about good aircraft and the different nations built. And we are even gonna include some nations that probably not many people talk about, like Italy. Italy had a very interesting history in regards of aircraft because they had really good designers, not gonna lie. I would even dare claim they had the best ones, but we'll talk about that. Now, should we just start with, I guess, when World War II started? Basically, when Germany invaded Poland, what aircrafts that were used? Well, basically, the main German fighter at the time was the B-109, the so-called E variants, which are, more often easily seen by, if you look at the wings of a B-109, they're usually rounded up. But the E variants had basically corners, which make them very obviously to, see the difference between other ones. And on the Allied side, and there were, of course, we are just looking at fighters, not at other aircraft. The Germans had a couple of other things, but let's just focus on that. The British used the Hurricane and the Spitfire, but as far as I remember, no Spitfire ever saw action during the Battle of France. It was later. So we take a look at the Hurricane, and then, of course, we cannot forget the French. The French also had fighter. They had, what was it called? The D520. Oh, and another aircraft which I don't remember. Oh, I'm kind of embarrassed. I don't remember. Basically, French aircraft sucked. I'm sorry, but they really do. French had a lot of fighter aircrafts, and all of them were very unsuccessful against the B-109. The French had though one aircraft. Oh, wait, I remember the name. The H-75. I was like, ooh, so the French actually designed one aircraft that did well against the Germans. They had I think a positive kill-to-death ratio, or shot down to being shot down. It was the only aircraft in French service that managed that. And I looked more at the aircraft and I was like, oh, it was imported from the US. Basically, there's an aircraft called the P-36 Hawk. And they made an export model for the French Air Force, which basically used French guns instead of American guns. And I find it kind of ironic how the best French aircraft in, the Battle of France was American made and not French made. I mean, they really had some interesting ideas, the French, but they were really not prepared for. I mean, we all know the French were not very prepared for how things turned out, or it wouldn't have turned out like that. But yeah, the H-75. Now, let us take a look at the B-109, the early variants, the B-109E1 especially, the Hurricane, I guess the Mark 1 and the Mark 2, and the H-75, A3, and A4 if I recall correctly. Now, let's compare the first week. Armament. B-109E1 was armed with 4 7mm machine guns, 2 in the nose with 1000 rounds per gun, and 2 in the wings with 500 rounds per gun, which I always found was kind of weird. There was the most common B-109 variant. The Hurricane, on the other hand, was actually armed with 8 7mm machine guns, all in the wings. Some other variants that actually, I always found kind of funny with British. Initially, they were like, 2 7mm are not enough for a fighter aircraft. And they were like, let's put in 4. I mean, 4 is not enough. Let's put in 8. I mean, 7mm is like, let's put in 12. Like, okay, there was only 2 aircraft which had 12 7mm machine guns, but I just found it funny, like, it's not good enough, let's put more on it. Now, the H-75 was armed with either 4 or 6 also 7mm machine guns, but as you can see, basically all fighter aircraft during the Battle of France used 7mm machine guns. Now, of course, all of them figured out 7mm are definitely not enough anymore. But generally, I would say that besides the H-75, but it was just, the numbers and the other aircraft, the B-109 was probably the most capable aircraft of these. And I guess the Germans became rather confident with the design and all that. And of course, we know in 6 weeks, France fell. The B-109 has proven itself. And then what would happen? Well, we will get the Battle of Britain, which is, most dominantly an air war to some extent, a war on the seas. And suddenly we would have a new British aircraft which didn't see action before, or at least not much, the Supermarine Spitfire against the B-109, probably one of the most iconic aircraft of the world. I'm just gonna stop the recording for now just in case it will corrupt it, and then I'll start. I hope you don't mind. Okay, let's resume. But yeah, Spitfire, Submarine Spitfire, Mark 1 and Mark 2. Mark 1A, Mark 1B, Mark 2A, Mark 2B. The Germans would go in with the B-19 E1, E3, and E4. Now, what are the differences? Now, the Spitfire and B-19 were probably rather equal, surprisingly equal in so many aspects. All of them would have a small advantage over the other. Like the B-19 was just a bit faster, the Spitfire did climb a bit better, did turn a bit better, the B-19 rolled a bit better. Both of them had garbage visibility. I think the Spitfire had probably better one. The B-19 was really compact. But yeah, let's look at the variants. We have the B-19 E1 4.7mm machine guns. But they of course noticed this was not enough. So, oh by the way, the top speed. Maybe I should talk about speed and climbing performance. Both the B-19 and Spitfire were around the same speed. I think the B-19 had around the top speed of 560 to 80 kilometers per hour. The Spitfire was also around that part. Climb rate was, the Spitfire was somewhat superior unless you would get at higher altitudes where the B-09 would slightly become better. But basically, 109 against Spitfire, it comes down to pilot skill and of course the initial situation and their respective tasks. But what I'm going to talk about now is, yes, the armaments of the variants. Germans noticed 7mm are really not enough. So, Germans looked at the weapons, and one of the weapons they had was a 20mm cannon. It was based on the Swiss Oerlikon cannon, and basically had a drum feed of 60 rounds, and they basically put, which they would later dub the 20mm MGFF in the wings. 60 rounds, very powerful, but very low velocity, not many rounds. As I said, the machine guns before in the wings at 500 rounds, they were replaced with cannons with 60 rounds. More powerful, lower rate of fire, lower velocity, more difficult to use, for sure. Now the Spitfire was armed with 8 7mm machine guns on the Mark 1A and the Mark 2A. The letter stands for the armament. And then there was also the Spitfire Mark 2B and 1B. Difference is they removed 4 of the 8 machine guns and switched them with also 20mm cannons. The Hispano cannon, Hispano Suiza, oh no wait, Hispano Mark 1s, Hispano Mark 2s, I don't remember for sure. But they also had drum feeds, 60 rounds, very similar. But the Spitfire still had 4 machine guns as backup, while the Germans had 2 machine guns as backup. But something you need to consider, the German ones were on the engine cowling, they were centrally mounted. Now, why is that relevant? Basically, if you have guns on the wings on an aircraft compared to something centrally mounted, you would basically shoot them, they would go straight, and basically it is very difficult to make both of the guns in the wings, or let's just say we have one per wing, hit at the same time. So you would basically have only half the firepower. What they did was they would basically angle the guns a bit inwards, so they would converge at a certain point. So there was a certain range where you were very likely to basically have all the guns pointing at the enemy. Now this could be 50 meters, 300 meters, I think 400 meters was generally the maximum people did, but generally pilots preferred lower distances. Now on the other hand, if you have centrally mounted weapons, you have basically a better range of where all the guns will, meet, especially if it's completely centered, then it doesn't matter. It will always hit when it hits. And the other guns, hopefully. Anyway, where am I going? But yes, of course, the B-49 had the guns, the cannons on the wings. So we see again, rather equal. But yes, and then of course the Spitfire Mark 2A and 2B, which of course is just the armament difference. The 2, you could actually say it was somewhat of a downgrade compared to the 1A, because They just added pilot protection. I mean, technically, that is a good thing. But they didn't improve anything on the aircraft. They just made it safer to be shot in. Which, of course, if you make it heavier, it performs slightly worse, but just slightly. And probably it probably helped a bunch of pilots to survive. Which is probably a good thing. So maybe it's not. I mean, performance-wise, it was slightly worse. And then, of course, we have the B09 E4. Now, the E4 was actually quite the redesign, which you will both notice on the cockpit. But generally, performance, somewhat similar, somewhat more powerful engine, and most notable, the first use of the dreaded so-called mine shells. The MGFFs were adapted to use a different kind of ammo, which were called Minengeschoss in German, or mine shells. Basically, and the gun was then dubbed MGFFM to designate it would use that sort of ammo. Basically, what the Germans were like, we need more high explosive power in the bullets, because bigger explosion makes bigger damage, more likely to shoot the aircraft down. And the mine shell was basically, you would use high quality steel, or maybe alloys, and basically make a thinner shell, which would be just as sturdy, so you can put in more explosive mass. In the end, German 20mm shells had 3 to 4 times the explosive mass of a 20mm shell that the British or Americans used. But more the Americans later, because they didn't use many 20mm. Oh, they are quite funny. Germans were the only nation to use it during World War II, and a lot of people were like, oh, it probably wasn't too good. Why doesn't anybody use it nowadays? Because everybody is. They're not called mine shells anymore, because regular high explosive shells are designed that way nowadays. So everybody uses it now because it has proven to be the best way to pack the most explosives in a bullet. And my god, they really pack quite the punch compared to regular 20mm, which are still more than enough, to be fair. Anyway, we have the B109E and the Spitfire Mark 1 and 2, and you could argue all day they are equally matched. Now, the British did have the home advantage, but the Germans had the advantage. They would choose when to attack, and they would usually, have the altitude advantage. And the Germans were rather successful at the beginning, and the Brits had quite the problems dealing with the German Air Force till, Goebbels messed things up, false reports, and so on, and basically made the B-109s have, I guess, escorts, you could say, or have them as escort duty, and they suddenly couldn't utilize the strengths anymore, which they could do before. And of course, if the pilots are equally matched, then the person with the more favorable position would always win, or most of the time. And that would be the British then. German losses were suddenly much higher. A lot of things happened in targets and so on. But yeah, it really came down to pilot skill and initial situation, like who had the altitude advantage. Oh, when I talk about altitude advantage, that is important because let's say you are the Spitfire pilot and you spot the B109 and you have 1000 altitude advantage. The thing is, you can't really, I mean, in theory you could, but aircraft cannot fly straight up. It will lose massive speed, it will stall and basically fall from the sky till it recovers. And that would make it very vulnerable. You have to climb slowly to gain altitude. Meanwhile, the Spitfire, it's very easy to dive and you would gain energy, speed. If you do it like that, you would convert your height into speed, energy into energy. And basically, the one who has the altitude advantage is the one who decides how the engagement will go. He can do whatever he wants or just go away. So altitude advantage is very important for an aircraft. If it's just fighter versus fighter, there are more things to consider, of course. I think now might be a good time to stop the recording and keep going a bit. Okay, let's keep going. But yeah, generally equally matched. Then something changed. The Germans actually designed another aircraft during their time, so-called Focke-Wulf 190A1. Now, that is a very interesting, probably one of my favorite aircrafts. Now they saw the B-109, it was a very light aircraft. They basically decided, you have this engine, we want to make an aircraft as light as possible of it. Which means it's rather small. And Goering, for all his faults, was actually a World War I ace. And he concluded that over time, you will have less experienced pilots. The longer the war goes on, more people will die. You get worse pilots. So you need another type of aircraft that is more forgiving for beginners. The Bf-109 was very difficult to fly. The Focke-Wulf was much bigger. It had a radial engine, the gears were much further out, so you wouldn't, fall on the sides as easy compared to a Bf-109, which had the gears very close at the center to save space and weight. And basically, it was designed to be faster, less maneuverable, much better roll rate. Basically, maneuverability in an aircraft works like this. Your aircraft has a certain weight, and depending on how, the more weight the wings have to carry, the worse it will turn. But at the same time, you can use the mass to basically roll better and change directions quicker. This is why some people would say the Focke-Wulf would be a better dogfighter compared to the Bf-109, because it's better at rolling, changing directions. But it would be worse at a flat turn. So one could argue about what makes a better dogfighter than the other. Basically, the Focke-Wulf was clearly not as good at climbing. It was not as maneuverable, but it was faster and it was more powerfully armed. And the first Focke-Wulf, the Focke-Wulf A1, was armed with 4 7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons, the MG-FFFs with the mine shells. And when the Germans started using the Focke-Wulf, it dominated. The British did not expect the Germans to suddenly roll out such an aircraft. It was too fast for the Spitfire. I think its top speed was around 630 to 50-ish. But the Spitfire was 580 kilometers per hour, so quite the difference. And of course, it could dive really well because of its higher mass, and it had much better visibility. It really was a much better aircraft for an inexperienced pilot. But of course, the Brits were not like, I guess we lost now. They decided to, they were aware that they just couldn't immediately, modify the Spitfire or make another aircraft that would just be like, okay, we have something that beats it. The first thing they did, they basically tried to lessen the distance between performance of the Spitfire and the Focke-Wulf by improving the Spitfire and turning it into the so-called Spitfire Mark V. That one had for standard 220mm and 47mm, so no difference in armaments on the same type. While it wouldn't be as powerful as the Focke-Wulf at the time, it just got much closer to that. The British were really like, we need to fix this now, this is very important to us. And we get to what the British came up with later. But yeah, so suddenly you have the Focke-Wulf 190 being quite the annoyance. Interesting enough, the Focke-Wulf 190A series doesn't get much better than it did at the beginning of its career, performance-wise. It did have a lot of other improvements. For example, they decided to basically the Focke-Wulf 190A3 and A4 and A5 would basically remove 2 of the 7mm machine guns in the wing roots, so the part of the wing that basically touches the hull or the fuselage, and would replace them with 20mm MG151s. Oh, that is quite the cannon. Basically, they looked at the MG-FFM, limited ammo, that's bad. Also, low velocity, low rate of fire. They improved all of that. It wasn't still, I wouldn't call it high velocity or high rate of fire, but it was such a massive improvement, and with the powerful shell, we suddenly had an aircraft with 4 20mm cannons and 2 7mm. This was incredibly powerful at the time. Also, the Focke-Wulf had a nickname, the so-called Butcher Bird, because it was simply that brutal with the firepower. To be fair, it started out with something decent and then it just got, I guess, better. The very late variant, the A8, would replace the two 7mm with two 30mm. Also, the MG-FFM would be replaced with another MG-151, and that is just insane firepower for an aircraft. Anyway, I skipped ahead because I like the forgot too much. So let's go back. Okay, you have the Battle of Britain. Then, of course, we had the North African campaign, where, I mean, we skipped the Battle of, Greece and Yugoslavia, but there's not too much to talk about air battles in that regard, like in the Battle of Poland, or Czechoslovakia. And we could talk about the Chinese War, which would be interesting. The Sino-Japanese, the second Sino-Japanese War. I'm just gonna save the video for now, 1 second. Okay, basically, should we do, before we go to North, let's start with North, I mean, that would basically coincide with the invasion of the Soviet Union, and then it gets interesting. But at the same time, the Japanese fought the Chinese since, I think, what's it, 36, 37, around that time. And now the Japanese are very boastful about, for example, when they made the so-called A6M0, which would be their most famous fighter, how basically on the first mission it did, it shot down dozens of Chinese aircraft without a single loss to them. And I'm like, the Chinese are using aircraft that have been obsolete for a decade at this point. It's no great feat, I'm sorry, but how well did the zero against the American later in the war? Suddenly it wasn't 20-0, was it? Anyway, if you don't have, it's like, German tanks did really well against Czechs and Poles. Like, I mean, they didn't have anything to count it reliably, so I'm sorry, but that is not a fair assessment to make. Anyway, let's keep going. But yeah, the Chinese would use a lot of obsolete Russian and European aircrafts, like the Gladiator, that is a British biplane, the I-15, a Russian biplane, and they really can't do too much against Japanese aircrafts because, they were just faster, generally more maneuverable, better climbing. Armament was around the same, but, well, it worked. I mean, it did kind of change when the American Flying Tigers came in with the P-40. Suddenly there was something that was capable of dealing with Japanese aircraft. The Flying Tigers, the P-40s, were armed. Now, we're talking about the first American aircraft, but there's a trend with American aircraft. That's basically, let's put it as many 50 caliber machine guns as we can on it. The P-40 was armed with 6 50 caliber machine gun. The 50 caliber machine gun was introduced 1918. Now it was extensively modified since then, and is still being used today. That is the pinnacle of heavy machine guns. Extremely high velocity, high rate of fire. It just is so powerful. The Americans kept using the 50 caliber machine gun well into the Korean War on aircraft. Well into the Korean War because it simply was that good to put that many heavy machine guns. Because high rate of fire, a lot of ammunition, high velocity makes it very reasonably easy to use compared to other weapons. But yeah, we are now at that point where we are comparing, I guess. Now, what did the Japanese use? Well, something that gets annoying with Japanese is they didn't have, like many nations, an independent air force. They basically had an army air force and a navy air force, and they basically designed their own aircraft. The navy were mostly designed by Mitsubishi, while the Land-based aircrafts were made by Kawasaki, I think. I'm not too sure, and they made some interesting design. Basically, they had very experienced pilots, and all of them were like, maneuverability is the key. Make the damn aircraft maneuverable. And the most notable Japanese aircraft, the Zero, and the most used Japanese aircraft, the land-based one, the Kai-43, are both so insanely maneuverable. They just, in a dogfight, they would not be able to be beaten by any aircraft in the world, you could say. But that is if you do that. Now, something that the Americans have figured out is basically, what if we make our aircraft faster than them, then we don't have to fight them when we don't want to, because they were really slow. And weirdly armed, the Zero was armed with two 7mm and two 20mm. The 20mm, the Type 99 cannons, the Mark 1, was also based on the Swiss Oerlikon cannon, low velocity, low rate of fire garbage basically. They never used mine shells. The Type 99 Mark II had much better velocity, but slightly lower rate of fire, but it was decent. Now the Kai-43 on the other hand that the Japanese used, it was initially armed with 7mm too, and later they upgraded it to two 12.7mm heavy machine guns. But there's a big difference between, I guess, Axis machine guns compared to American ones, because they used much different ammunition. German, Italian, and Japanese heavy machine guns, much lower rate of fire, much lower velocity, and instead of armor piercing, they used usually rounds with high explosive filler. And while I guess if it hits the target, it would be more effective, but the Americans were just, the rate of fire would make up for it easily. So I would say the American machine guns are more capable than every heavy machine gun the Axis put together on aircraft, that is. Now the Navy used 13.2mm machine guns to a very low extent, and that thing would have just been maybe even just a bit better than American 50 caliber machine gun, but they barely used it on aircraft, so I'm usually discount that one. The Japanese aircraft, really, 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 really slow. Decent climbers, but god are they I'm sorry, they are freaking slow. They were highly successful against the Chinese because they had even worse aircraft. They were very successful against the initial American ones, but the Americans didn't plan for a war, did they? If you fight a nation that isn't prepared, you are gonna have the advantage because the American Navy aircraft they used at the time was the F-2A Buffalo and the F-4F Hellcat, both armed with 4 heavy machine guns. They weren't very fast and they didn't maneuver very well, so the Japanese had a clear advantage. Now later on the Americans were like, okay, we see now how this works. We are gonna make something that's fast that the Japanese cannot catch. And the Navy made 2 aircraft, the F4, the F6F Hellcat, which was just simply faster, and that one shot down way more Japanese aircraft than the Japanese did on the other way around, and the F4U Corsair, but that one to a lesser extent. The Hellcat wasn't even that insanely impressive an aircraft. I love it, but I love most American Navy aircraft. They're really cool. It was armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns, didn't climb well, didn't turn well, but it was fast. And that is all the thing you need. And Japanese were still like, make our aircraft maneuverable. We don't need speed, we need maneuverability. And the Americans were like, screw that, we're just gonna make them blistering fast. And they were simply much faster, around at least 40 kilometers per hour faster, up to 100. Like the latest Zero could reach, I think, 580-ish kilometers per hour top speed, while the best P-51, the fastest one, could reach 700 kilometers per hour. That is a 120 kilometers per hour advantage at max speed. That is insane. But yeah, let's just do another recording because I don't want to lose any of these. Anyway, where was I? But yes, now the Japanese did make some, like, over the time they would be like, maybe we need to stop focus on the maneuverability part. They actually made some aircraft which are still maneuverable, like, but they actually would be faster. And the only notable one, like, there's the J2M, which I think is the coolest Japanese aircraft, but that one was still damn slow, even though it would climb better and it could dive better. So it still could technically be fast, but generally it was not under regular circumstances. The Kai 84 Hayate. That thing was an aircraft that was well armed, was very fast, did climb well, and was just a good armed aircraft. I mean, there's not much else to say. The Kai 84 was an excellent machine, probably, even though I don't like it that much, probably the best Japanese aircraft during World War II. And that one was simply very good. It just didn't have anything bad on it. Now, of course, you can talk about reliability and all that, but then it would get complicated. Anyway, interestingly enough, the American Navy did design another aircraft at the end of the war when Germany already capitulated, which would be the F F8F Bearcat. That thing. My god, the Japanese would have. They could have just all thrown themselves into the sea at that point. The Bearcat compared to anything the Japanese designed. Like at the very end, the Japanese designed the Kai 100. That thing wasn't very fast. It didn't turn too well compared to the Zero and so on, but they focused on let's make an aircraft reliable. It was still more maneuverable than anything the Americans had, but it wasn't, too insanely special. Meanwhile, the Americans were like, yeah, we're gonna make it so blistering fast. We're gonna make it climb insanely well. We're gonna put so many cannons on this machine. Nothing will stand against it. And in the end, nothing did because the Japanese capitulated at the time. But there would have been no answer to that by the Japanese. To some extent, the Germans would have had something we will talk about later. But generally, the Germans would have had a bad time too, just like everybody else fighting against that monstrosity of an aircraft. And that one was also armed with only 450 caliber machine gun. The later variants were adapted to 420 millimeter cannons with nearly 1,000 rounds in total, which is insane. Anyway, we jumped a bit there. Well, I guess we kind of talked about the Pacific Theater and are done with it. Now, let's talk about the North African campaign and the Italians. Because the Italians actually made really interesting aircraft. They had, at the beginning, 3 aircraft available at the beginning of World War II. The CR-42, which was a biplane, so basically it was already obsolete. Now, something I not may know, the Italian Air Force had the biggest air force at the beginning of World War II. A lot of them were sadly obsolete, or luckily, I guess, depending on how you want to view it. Yeah, the CR-42, it was technically a very good biplane, but it kind of sucked. Not gonna lie, it kind of sucked. It wasn't very good. It had a shit cockpit. You couldn't see anything, and you kind of need to see something when you're in an aircraft. On the other hand, they had 2 other aircraft which were also not very successful, both monoplanes. The Fiat, yes, Fiat, G50, and the Machi C200. Both of them very similar, open cockpits, very thick. They were very thick. G50, very maneuverable, very slow. C200, less maneuverable, faster, but I guess not too. I mean, it was decent speed. Both of them armed with 2 heavy machine guns in the engine cowling, low rate of fire, low velocity, decent punch on them, but nothing. But the biggest problems the Italian aircraft had, they didn't have any radios on them. What does that mean? Well, that means you can't communicate with the land-based units or other aircraft. They had to communicate by wriggling the wings, which is kind of not very practical because how would you communicate? Hey, I have someone on me and he is killing me. Even though both of them were okay. Now, the Fiat G50 is important later because Italy donated some of them to Finland, which we'll take later about. Now the Italians did make basically the main fighter, the C-202. The C-202, basically Italians didn't know how to make guns or engines. So initially the Germans gave the Italians some engines. They made the C-202, which was an excellent aircraft. It was just the Italians looked at what they had and were like, this won't good. This won't do any good. They were like, let's make this, and it was excellent. Still had no radio, which basically made it obsolete in my opinion, but I love the C-202. It's such a great aircraft. Same armament as before, 2 heavy machine guns. Some of them were upgraded to 7mm additionally in the wings, but those are 7mm. It's nothing to write home about. And generally, it wasn't too spectacular. Now the Italians, the other companies, made similar aircraft. The C-202 was also accompanied by the Reggiane 2001, which was just slightly slower, better maneuvering, but you could nearly say it's the same. Now, during 42 and 43, the Italians were like, okay, we really need to step up our game. And my god, did they do that. Basically, Reggiane, Fiat, and Machi all designed the aircraft, which were very similar and yet very different. They had radios at that point. They also had cannons from Germany, so 20mm mine shell shooting beasts. And they made 3 different aircrafts, the C-205, the Fiat G55, and the Reggiane 2005. All of them similar, yet very different. Now the MC-205 was the fastest one, but did turn the worst. The Reggiane 2005 was basically slightly slower, better turning, and then the G55 was the best turning one, but the slowest one. All had around similar armaments. All of them would pack 1 to 3 20mm and 2 to 4 50 caliber machine guns. Like the G55 had 1 20mm and 4 50 caliber machine guns, all centrally mounted, or 3 20mm, 2 50 cals. The MC-205 had 2 20mm, 2 50 cals. Reggiane had 3 20mm and 2 50 cals. So all of them really powerful armed. And these aircrafts were insanely brutal for their time. But before they could build even 100 of any of them, Italy capitulated. Now they did still see some action and service, and they were simply insanely excellent aircraft, but not many of them were built, and Italy is often forgotten, even though you could argue that these aircraft were insanely powerful and excellent. Even though, the Germans had the very advanced Focke-Wulf 109, but they were looking at, they had a new engine which was more powerful, but they couldn't fit it in a Bf-109. So they were looking for replacements. And they looked at the Italian designs and found the G55 and were like, we could fit that engine in there. That aircraft would later become known, or the prototype, 2 prototypes, the Fiat G56, which was basically a joint German and Italian design in 1943. And you could say that prototype might have been the best propeller-driven aircraft in World War II. During the test, they were so impressed by it that they actually wanted to put this into production in Germany as the main fighter. You need to think this. They basically, in the Italian design, were like, this is better than everything else we have. We kinda want this. But the German industry calculated that the production numbers would drop by 60 to 70%, and that was simply unacceptable. So no matter how powerful it would never leave the prototype stage. And so you could say that aircraft might have been one of the best, if not the best, propeller-driven aircraft, but who knows for sure. Anyway, that is Italy out of the way. Now we're going to North Africa. Now, basically, there wouldn't be that many aircraft that would see action there because of the geographic limitations. It didn't have priority or the highest priority, even though it was important. The Germans used their B109, but it wouldn't be the E variant anymore at this point. They would basically massively overhaul the B109 design, make it more streamlined, make it rounder, I guess. And we would get the B109F1 and F2. And basically didn't have cannons in the wings anymore. Germans would start with a central mounted engine cannon. The F1 had the MG-FFM with 60 rounds, and the F2 would have a 15mm heavy machine gun with 200 rounds. That is the MG151-15, which would later be adopted to become the MG151 or MG151-20, which would become basically guns the Germans would stick with nearly most of the war on most of their aircraft. Anyway, I'm gonna restart the clip recording, and we are back. Okay, am I not cute? I'm cute. Tell me in the comments that I'm cute. Anyway, where was I? And the Spitfire would basically modify the Spitfire Mark V to tropical versions and so on. I would basically stick with that one. During the later stages of the North African campaign, the Germans would adapt to the B19F4 and G2 tropical variants. Now, the F1 and F2 were basically a stopgap measure because they were initially planning to upgrade the engine, but they didn't build enough of them yet. So they just made the more streamlined aircraft. So it would become faster, would become a bit heavier, so less acceleration, before they could put in the big engines. And the F4 and the G2 did have a much more powerful engine. They would become really fast, they would still be maneuverable, they would have a 20mm cannon nose, 2 7mm in the engine cowling, very powerful, very cool. Now, I guess we'll get to the Soviets. Now, the Soviets were not really prepared for what was about. Now, the Soviets, all things considered, did have an interesting air fleet because most notably, they had the so-called I-16 Ishak. That wing was initially armed with 2 7mm, later with 4, and the I-16 Ishak was the first all-metal monoplane. It was insanely impressive for its time. But its time was over. The Germans didn't have much trouble with them. In addition, they had the so-called Yak-1. The Yak-1 was a good aircraft, but it was not as good as a B-109, and the LAGG or LAG-3, which was even worse, and the MiG-3, which was a high-altitude aircraft with weird armament, and there was no high-altitude fighting, so that one wasn't too successful as well. Generally, the Russians were not very successful with their air force. Now, of course, when you see that your aircrafts are not doing too well, what do? You adapt them, and then did they, change things around rather surprisingly quickly and impressively. Now, this is also the time that the Americans can come into play, and they would start being, like, okay, we're gonna design our aircraft. We have, God, where do we start? We have the P-39 Cobra, the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-51 Mustang for the Army Air Force. God, now it just gets... Oh, let's just look at the Eastern Front. The Russians would basically adapt the aircraft to the so-called... They would make the Yak-9. That one was a very good aircraft, and the Russians were rather interesting. They didn't really want a lot of guns. They just wanted powerful weapons, centrally mounted. It didn't need to have much ammunition, but if you hit the enemy, it should explode. You want precise and powerful. And that is what the Russians got, which means usually a 20mm cannon in the nose with 1 or 2 heavy machine guns in addition. And damn, that was powerful. Some had also 220mm in the nose, which was also quite impressive. Now, if we talk about Russian aircraft, we have the Yak-9, the Yak-1, the Yak-1B, the Yak-3, the Yak-9U, the LA-5, the LA-5FN, and the LA-7. And all of them are, rather impressive in a way. Now, the Yak-3 was not very impressive. The LAGG-3 wasn't too fast, it wasn't too maneuverable, didn't climb well, and armament was good, but if you can't, do something with it, it would become problematic. So they upgraded to the LA5, which basically you could say kinda seemed like a Focke-Wulf. It was very fast. It was basically a more maneuverable Focke-Wulf, but slightly slower and less armed. And they would put a more powerful engine on it, which would be called the LA5F, an even more powerful engine, the LA5FN. In the end, they would do the LA7, which was just so brutally powerful, you wouldn't believe it. It was really fast, it did climb excellently, still had 220mm, and it was just, Germans had nothing to deal with it, I guess. At low altitude, the two top Russian fighters, the LA-7 and the Yak-3, were so effective at low altitude that the Germans actually said to the pilots, don't engage Russian aircraft below 6,000 meters. Or was it 5,000? I don't remember the correct number, but basically it would be rather one-sidedly. The Russians' aircraft were designed for low altitude and they would always win if we have equal situations, which of course doesn't happen always. Now the Yak-3 and the LA-7 were basically king of low altitude. There was also the Yak-9U, which was a Yak-9, which was basically the first aircraft Yaroslav designed after, the Yak-1 not being good enough. They basically just improved it, made it better. It was an excellent aircraft. Nothing insanely impressive, but really good. They also converted the Yak-1 to the Yak-9 standard, which was called the Yak-1B. One heavy machine gun, one cannon, very good. The Yak-3 would take the cake though. That thing is just more maneuverable, better climbing, better armed. It was just so good in every way, you wouldn't believe it. And the Yak-9U was basically, you could say, a Yak-3, less maneuverable, but much faster, more powerful engine. Same armament, but that thing was that one was brutal. But yeah, I'm kind of trying to get this closer to the end. I wonder if you noticed, because I'm just trying to go through the nations at this point. Maybe I'll talk about this another time thoroughly. Now, what did the Germans do? The Germans were... Okay, now let's talk about the Americans. The Americans and Britain basically did bombing raids over Germany to basically disrupt the German industry and defeat them like that eventually. And these bombers would function at high altitude. Now, the British didn't have any high altitude escort fighters. So after losing a lot of bombers, they decided, let's bomb them at night. But the Americans were a bit more bold. They also started bombing at day. The bombers would get shot down because they didn't have any protection, adequate one, that is. They did have decent protection, but not good enough. So the Americans designed escort fighters. And the Americans actually pulled it off, unlike the British. Oh, we still have to talk about 3 British aircraft, by the way. Ooh, I wonder how long this video will be, how it will work. Anyway. Oh god, where do we start? Let's just talk about the British aircraft first. Now, the Spitfire would eventually become the Spitfire Mark 9, the LF Mark 9 and the F Mark 9. That thing was an upgrade on the Spitfire, which would make it superior to the Bf-109s at the time. It's simple as that. It was just suddenly much more powerful, it could climb so much better, it was still more maneuverable and just as fast. So it basically defeated all the disadvantages they had, and was generally a better aircraft. Very late in the war, now the engine that the Spitfire had was called a Merlin engine, and that one was very late in war replaced with an engine that was called Griffin. This is why we usually call the late Spitfires Griffin. They didn't build many of them, but the Griffin Spitfire was a high altitude Spitfire which was faster, more maneuverable, better climbing than anything the Germans had. Basically. Now, some exceptions are the but, of course, that was very late. Germans designed to improve the aircraft just like the British did and everybody else. And then, of course, there's the Typhoon and the Tempest, which are both. Oh, my hands. Gonna have to restart my arm, maybe. 1 second, please. Ah. Don't look. Please. Oh, yay, hands. Gonna love those. And I'm actually in full body, I'm not sure. I don't think you can see it with the camera, maybe if I go further back. Ooh la la. Yay. But yeah, let's. Ooh. Oh my. Oh, getting so close. What are you looking at? Oh, anyway, we're talking about something more important. My bad. But yeah, basically, where was I? I think I'm just running a bit out of steam. I did work today. I just spontaneously decided I had this great idea. But yeah, Typhoon, Tempest, very fast, insanely fast, very powerful armament, very effective. And interestingly, we are not going to my favorite aircraft, the later variants on the Focke-Wulf and the German jets and the British jets and the American P-39, the P-51, P-38 and P-47. But I feel like I talked a lot. I wonder how. I feel like it's an hour probably. I wonder if I have. Oh my. Why are you getting so close? Is there something you like? Something you like that you see? Wink. Winky. Do you want a kiss from me? I can do that. For the right price. Anyway. But yeah. I'm getting a bit tired. It is getting late. I did work today, so I hope you understand. I feel like I'm gonna talk about this again because I love talking about aircraft. I actually had this whole conversation about aircraft with 2 people today, and also in my head by myself initially. So this is basically, I guess, the 4th time I'm talking about this nonsense. But anyway, I hope you will have a lovely day. I hope you will have a lot of reasons to smile today. No. Goodbye.